Hi there, and welcome to another Upstream Ag Insights Cognitive Bias overview. My name's Shane Thomas. So today we're going to touch on status quo bias, but at a high level, what I want these videos and overviews to do is really help deliver an understanding of cognitive biases. And every strategic decision in agribusiness runs through our brains, and our brains weren't built for capital allocation or long-term strategy. They're more focused on optimizing for food or to avoid predators and short-term decision making. And so the result is predictable patterns of suboptimal thinking that researchers call cognitive biases. And so I wanted to put this series together because the higher the stakes in your role, the more these biases can distort judgment in ways that are difficult to catch in the moment. And so the aim is to really deliver awareness plus some modest structural defenses against the biases that are most likely to cost you in your decision making. And so we've already touched on not invented here bias and the IKEA effect, and today we're going to touch on the status quo bias. And status quo bias is one of the most underestimated forces in decision making. It quietly shapes capital allocation, distribution strategies, R&D priorities, and personnel decisions across every company in the industry. And most individuals and leadership teams don't realize that it's even operating in the background. And what it is the systematic preference for the current state of affairs over alternatives, even when the alternatives are objectively better. It is the reason we say we've always done it this way. It was formally documented by William Samuelson and Richard Zeckhauser in 1988 in a paper titled Status Quo Bias in Decision Making, which was published in the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty. And across a series of experiments, they showed that when people are presented with options where one is labeled the existing default, that option gets disproportionate weight. The default gets chosen because it's the default, and the familiarity does the work, not the actual analysis of the underlying problem or solution or decision. And so the bias operates through essentially three reinforcing mechanisms that we will go over more in depth at another time. But the first is loss aversion. So any change involves giving up something, and losses feel about twice as painful as equivalent gains. Second is the endowment effect, which is us valuing what we already have more than what we could acquire. And third, simple cognitive and operational inertia. And so doing nothing essentially requires no effort, no analysis, no defense necessary to reinforce the decision. And so the reason this is detrimental in all business, but agribusiness is what we'll zero in on today, is that it really tends to get amplified in or by different structural dynamics within a business. And so the first is really the asymmetry of accountability. And so a leader who changes the distribution model of their business and it fails will get fired or demoted or whatever it might be. And so a leader who keeps the existing distribution model while market share quietly or slowly erodes for 5 years rarely faces the same scrutiny. The career math tends to favor inaction. And so there is even the saying in business that nobody gets fired for buying IBM because that's considered the standard. If you do that, even if it doesn't work out, that's what you're supposed to do. If you go with the scrappy startup and things don't work out, well, you look like a crazy person. And so that is one component that really keeps the status quo bias engaged and a problem. The second is the relational depth within the industry. And so you have long-standing dealer relationships or supplier agreements and customer accounts that can create real switching costs. And so some of those costs are economic, but some are emotional or political, and all of those work against actual change. And the third is complexity, which is just restructuring a sales force or re-platforming a CRM or repositioning a brand or exiting a product line involves a bunch of different considerations, a bunch of different partners, seasonal timing, customer trust. And so there's difficulty in change that makes inaction look prudent even when the data says otherwise, to adapt your distribution strategy or your product strategy, your positioning strategy, whatever it might be. And so these costs tend to show up as delayed responses to market shifts. And so we have the status quo, and so it looks like we're just slow to react, when the reality is there's probably people talking about different things internally in a business for months or years probably before something comes along. But because we tend to favor the status quo and see what happens, we'll wait another year, whatever it might be, that's when it starts to look like a delayed response. And so companies tend to hold on to declining brands or maintain the specific structures keep R&D focused the way it is and preserve organizational charts as they have always been. And so that's really the problem in and of itself. And we all see it, we've all experienced it, we all know that it's a challenge. And I think what's interesting is to look at how do you overcome it. And there's no easy way to do this necessarily, but even in the initial research by Samuelson and Zeckhauser, the discoverers of the initial, call it paper of identifying status quo bias, they said that one of the starting questions needs to be not should we change, but you need to start thinking and asking, if we were designing this from scratch today, knowing what we know now, would we build what we currently have? And that starts to reframe the entire conversation around the decision, around the actions that you take. And so it really becomes an active choice rather than having just a standard default. And in those sorts of instances, the status quo loses its inherent claim to that preference. And so it has to compete on the same terms as every alternative that gets brought forth. And so it becomes an actual conversation and discussion and an analytic sort of approach where you can actually show how things could play out or what things have changed given the current dynamics. The second tactic is really structural, and it comes back to a similar dynamic, but essentially you build a zero-based review into your annual strategy process. And so this could be pick one major element of the business model each year to discuss and go in depth. Whether, again, it could be anything at a leadership level: distribution, compensation, product portfolio, R&D allocation, geographic footprint, whatever it might be, but you force the team to defend its existence against alternatives rather than forcing alternatives to defend themselves against it. And so that is what reframes and kind of puts things on that level playing field. And so most years you're going to continue doing the existing thing. And we know there's a reason a lot of these things are in place in the first place, because they work, because they were successful at some point. But the world is not static, it's dynamic, it's always changing. And so you need to think about things more critically. And then the third tactic is really to separate the people defending the status quo from the people evaluating it, which basically means the team that built the specific route to market or marketing strategy is the wrong team to, in and of themselves, evaluate whether there's change needed. It's good to bring in outside perspective. It's good to put a different business unit in the same conversation, or a junior team without that sort of organizational memory and experience to come in and have the conversation. And so they'll bring different questions, they'll bring different scenarios, and they will hopefully get to a better answer. And I'm not crazy. I know that a lot of this takes work, it takes resources, it takes effort. It is something else to do or put on your plate. But I do think fundamentally that status quo bias is one of the biggest hindrances within many agribusinesses. And again, sometimes it's not so much about actually doing something from a specific change management perspective, but having the conversation in detail to really pressure test whether there's a need to adapt or change, because then you have an understanding, you start to look at things differently, you start to really become hypersensitive to things that you see in the market that could say, oh, this is changing, this was one of the things that actually had us say, oh, we're going to keep going this way, but now that's changed. How do we adapt? How do we change? How do we make this become something else for our business to do moving forward? And so I do think it's really important on that front. And I think fundamentally the status quo bias catches sharp operators, smart people, just as easily as everybody else. We all get tripped up by it. And our cognitive software runs the same way regardless of experience or intelligence. So we need to mentally force ourselves to switch it up and change. And so if you build some of that structural friction that I alluded to with bringing in a different team or forcing a conversation or forcing a reframe, that's what's going to separate organizations that adapt from the organizations that have to sit and explain why they didn't. And so with that, that's the overview of the status quo bias. If you have any questions, comments, reach out. If you have any suggestions for the next edition, please shoot me a message at shane@upstream.com.